When I was starting out, I heard the same advice. Oh, don't get emotionally committed. You got to maintain your distance, blah, blah, blah. And the truth is that whether I wanted to or not, I could never do that. I just naturally was able to on some level empathize with a client, no matter what they were accused of doing.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. All right, this is a quote from a new book called American Injustice: Inside Stories from the Underbelly of the Criminal Justice System, written by our very special guest today, David Rudolph. And it goes like this: we must face the harsh reality that our criminal justice system is not just fallible. It suffers from systemic inherent faults and abuses of power by police and prosecutors that routinely produce erroneous convictions of innocent people. Helping us get set for sentencing today, I am so excited to welcome David Rudolph. Before we get, hi, thank you, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you, Doug, for having me. It's great to be back with you.
Yes, and before we dig in, I have a little treat, which is for those of you who know David, and that's a lot of you. Lead lawyer for Michael Peterson in the acclaimed Netflix documentary, The Staircase. And David and I actually worked together on a continuing legal education project for attorneys, and with that, we were able to get some of the footage that went to the cutting room floor. And so I was looking through some of this stuff, and I found this little clip that I just thought would help set the tone for us today. So I'm going to share the screen, share the sound, and I'm going to take you on a little trip down memory lane.
Oh, thank you, Doug. I appreciate it.
Traumatizing memory lane.
You don't think that's relevant to his credibility in front of this jury? I'm not going to ask him about his religious views. I'm going to ask him about his scientific views about various items, such as, when did the dinosaurs exist? Were they here 6,000 years ago? I'm not going to ask him about his Gideon's Bible stuff. Because he's being called as a scientist, Jim. And I think the jury's entitled to know what kind of scientist he is. If you don't particularly feel comfortable with putting a scientist who believes that the world is 6,000 years old on, then don't call him. That's your choice.
That particular clip, for those who couldn't see it, it was a bench conference, but the Jim Harden was the trial counsel. And
Jim was complaining about me cross-examining one of his experts about some of his crazy beliefs. And as I said, if you're uncomfortable with that, don't call him. It's really easy.
You were fighting about whether this so-called scientist, Dr. Mr. Shabani, was going to get to testify about dunking heads in toilets. But what I love about this clip is I think it just epitomizes you, or at least my take on you, which is you're fearless. You're fearless in trial. You're fearless in seeking justice for those who have been wrongfully convicted in the system, and you are fearless for speaking your truth out loud. And so like I mentioned, some of that out loud is your brand new book, American Injustice, which we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about The Staircase. And your other out loud is that you co-host an incredible podcast with your law partner and life partner, Sonia Pfeiffer. And it's called Abuse of Power. Is that exclusively on Audible, that podcast now?
It is now exclusively on Audible. It started off on Apple, but Audible purchased it, and so they now have the exclusive rights to it.
I love it, and it's it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy to speak that truth because there are a lot of powerful forces that make that system go, and all the inequities in that system go, and so it means a lot. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to our clients that you do that. So I just want to start off by saying thank you, and
Well,
I want to, yeah.
thank you for saying that. I mean, I appreciate that. I've reached a point in my career where I care less about all those powerful people, so it gets easier to speak out because the consequences don't affect me quite as much as they may affect other people.
And so the staircase is a very small part of, well, the Peterson trial is a very small part of American Injustice. I'm going to tell you what I love about. Well, I'm going to tell you what I love about the book and what I hated about the book. What I hated about the book is that it is traumatizing, especially for a defense lawyer, to hear all of these stories of people getting, and it's not just like, oops, accidents happen. These are people lying, cheating, hiding evidence. Every dirty trick in the book that ends up with people in prison for 10, 20, 30 plus years and losing their entire lives. And so from a guy who's been doing criminal defense for 25 plus years, I usually shy away from those stories because I live those stories and they're really, really hard.
Indeed.
But they're so important. And here's what blew me away about the book, just in terms of the sheer volume of stories about injustices. Almost all of them, if not every single one, was out of North Carolina, right?
Yeah, and that was something we were concerned about because we didn't want people to have the impression that this is a North Carolina problem. And so, obviously, those are the stories that I know best. We tried to include some stories of people in other places, but the real message of the book is this is not about North Carolina. What this is about are the problems that all of us face all over the country every single day that we defend people. And it really comes down, as I say in the book, to confirmation bias and tunnel vision. I don't think police officers are out to set up or convict innocent people. I think they just decide somebody's guilty, and then the ends justify the means.
Yep. And as far as North Carolina goes, I don't think the takeaway is North Carolina is really messed up. My takeaway is, man, if it's that many cases in just this one state, think about how many cases there are going to be all over the country, everywhere. And so that was terrifying.
That's exactly.
And North Carolina, I didn't even know there was such a thing as the Innocence Commission or whatever they have set up to try to safeguard against some of this stuff, but we don't have anything like that in Arizona. I don't know.
And a lot of these cases, a lot of these stories came through the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. So, some of these stories would have never seen the light of day, but for that commission.
Yeah. So now I'm going to tell you what I love about the book. First of all, there's so much to love about the book, but first of all, it's just great storytelling. And the best stories are the ones with the richest detail, right? And that's what makes these stories. And also the human element that you infused into these stories. So because sometimes it's hard to conceptualize the depth of the injustice when you're talking about court procedure and this expert or Brady material or these things, but you get into the human elements of a life stolen over and over again. And it's so beautiful and heartbreaking that these stories, that even when they're exonerated, what they lost, what the graduations they miss with their kids, or seeing their families grow up, or the one story about the guy who got a settlement and was going to buy his dream house, and then he got cancer and died 2 years later or something.
Well, and I thought it was important to do that, to try to get people invested in the emotional costs of these abuses, because there's been lots of books written about the causes of wrongful conviction and statistics on wrongful conviction, and analyzing false confessions or analyzing junk science and what role they play and how many people are convicted based on this or based on that. And I wanted to get away from that. And as you say, I think the way to get people interested in anything is to tell stories. It's part of what you do in your sentencings. You want to tell stories, and it's something that any good trial lawyer wants to do, is to tell stories. It's how people have communicated from time immemorial. So the idea was to drill down into the impact that these things had, not just to describe what happened, but how it happened and what the consequences were to the people it happened to. And hopefully, those are the attributes that will make people enjoy reading the book, even if the message of the book is awfully serious.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of the reason our system tends to be so broken is because it's very good at stripping the humanity out of the process. And we kind of get taught that way as lawyers too, just get to the facts and get to the law, but you put the humanity back in this. And here's the other thing that I love about the book. In speaking of humanity, it's a book about wrongful convictions and injustice, but you start out the book with the client that's 100% guilty, and he's on death row, and he's facing execution for a really horrible crime. There's just no dispute that he committed. And it goes this answering this question that we get asked by everyone all the time right off the bat, which is, how do you defend those people? And you started out with one of the proverbial those people. And I was kind of wondering what your thought process was with doing that.
Well, my thought process was that when people read the book, their first thought was going to be, oh, here comes another defense lawyer. He's just trying to get people off, and they have a really unfortunate and erroneous view of what we do and why we do it. And I thought it was really important to take on that question of, why do we do what we do? And the best way to do that was to take one of the worst cases I have ever represented anybody in and explain what the humanity was, even in that person, and what I was trying to do even in that case where there was no defense and the crime was horrific, and to humanize that person. And I think, if I was successful in doing that, then maybe people would be a little bit more open to hear what I had to say about the injustices that I was going to write about. So it was a very conscious decision to just hit that head on, because, as you say, we get asked it all the time. And my answer to that question has really changed over the years, Doug. I used to give the sort of standard, oh, everybody deserves a defense, the system would break down, blah, blah, blah. And I don't believe that anymore. I think that what we do is we serve as almost, how should I put it? We are there to give context to the other players in the system, so that the decisions that they make can be informed by real facts. And so, the way I view my role now is not that I'm trying to get somebody off. I'm trying to give the decision makers, and because I'm not a decision maker in the system,
Right.
I'm just a player. But the decision makers, the judges, the prosecutors, the juries, they deserve to have all of the facts presented to them in a coherent and meaningful way so that they can make decisions based on those facts, not on assumptions or prejudices or biases or whatever they bring to the table. So that's how now I explain. I often say, when a mass shooter is brought to the hospital with gunshot wounds, nobody asks the doctor, how can you operate on that person?
Yep.
He just killed 12 people. How can you operate on that person? And the answer is because that's my job. I'm there to try to save a life. Well, it's no different for us. That's what we're there for. We're there to try to save a life and to explain to people what our client did and why he did it. And, as you know, 98% of the time, we're just pleading people guilty. We're plea
Yep.
bargaining.
Yep.
We're not going to trial very much, particularly these days.
Right.
So, I think I've really changed my view of how to explain why I do what I do.
Yep. And that's why we're doing the podcast. I mean, the truth of the matter is almost all of our clients are going to end up before a judge, sometimes a jury, for sentencing.
Exactly.
And yeah, and the idea of making sure they have all the facts. Now, some lawyers are going to fulfill that responsibility, but they're going to kind of do it holding their nose, and they're going to do it in a way that they still themselves put up some barriers to really truly knowing your client and knowing their life story and connecting with them in a way that brings them to life and makes them defined by more than their worst moment in time, right? And so, what would you say? 'Cause, I mean, a lot of lawyers, and it's a debate. It's a legitimate debate to have. I'm here to be your lawyer. I'm not here to be your social worker. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm not here to sit and hold your mother's hand and explain this process to her. What would you say, especially to younger lawyers starting out who maybe haven't hit their stride about what their role is, about what we need to do as lawyers to fulfill that responsibility of making sure the decision maker has the full picture of our clients?
Well, this may be heresy, but I have never believed that I should not be emotionally connected to my clients. When I was starting out, I heard the same advice. Oh, don't get emotionally committed. You got to maintain your distance, blah, blah, blah. And the truth is that whether I wanted to or not, I could never do that. I saw too much gray in the world. I didn't see things in black and white. And I just naturally was able to, on some level, empathize with a client, no matter what they were accused of doing. Now, I won't say it happened all the time. I mean, you run up against some people who are just so unlikable that you can't really even empathize, no matter how hard you try. But for the most part, I find it impossible not to connect on some emotional level with my client, and I don't think I can be as effective an advocate if I haven't, because I think when you're up there talking, people get a sense of whether you really believe what you're saying or not.
Right.
And if
Right.
you're, I mean, we all have seen that. Some salesman comes in and he's giving you a spiel, and that it's a spiel, and
Hmm.
you listen with half an ear.
Right.
Um, and that's what I think happens with lawyers who really don't care about what they're doing or about their clients. They're getting up and giving a spiel,
Hmm.
and people take it for what it is. Whereas if you're up there talking from your heart, uh, I think that makes a difference. Now, maybe I'm naive and maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's how I've approached it.
Well, I don't think you're naive and wrong about that. I think that that's exactly right. And not only are they giving a spiel, but a lot of times they're giving the same spiel over and over. And a lot of times it's in front of the same judge because a lot, it's sometimes
Right.
with small practice, it's the same. And it's like, okay, here we go again with that. And I think the only way through that and around that and to embrace that is to connect with that person and learn who they are. And the little details matter. Like when you talk about you're with this client who's going to die and you're with him up to his last hours and his he gets a last meal. Do you remember what his last meal was?
Yeah, something like, I mean, it was something like from, McDonald's or something.
12 hot dogs all the way.
Right.
And just that small little detail about who he is and what he loves um, instantly connected me to that person because I go to hot dog. I eat hot. That's how me and my father bond. We try to find the very best hot dog in the town, and all the way is like a New York thing. New York system wieners. You get them all the way with the chili and
Yep.
the onions.
Yep.
So people who know hot dogs know, all the way. This guy knows his hot dogs. It's just
Exactly.
little stupid facts like that. All of a sudden, they're a human being, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so these stories, they're so good. I'm going to do an exercise with you, and this is maybe hard, maybe easy for you. When we have a case, whether it's a trial or sentencing or whatever, the hardest thing we could do is boil the whole thing down to one word. And I have this little template that I use, and it goes like this: nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. So for you, I'm going to ask you: nothing in criminal injustice makes sense except in the light of what's the one thing that animates this whole story of this book?
Human frailty.
Hmm. Tell me more.
Well, as I said, I don't think police officers or prosecutors or judges are out to get innocent people. I think that they are motivated by a desire to, you know, punish criminals. I get that. And I think that because we are all human, we all suffer from various cognitive biases. It's just human nature. And
Yeah.
among the cognitive biases we suffer from are confirmation bias, and tunnel vision, which is a close cousin to confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So when I look at these cases, and I look back on the cases I've handled, um, I can think of one case in the book where I thought the police intentionally set out to frame an innocent person to protect themselves. The other cases all involved what I would call noble cause corruption, which is a nice way of saying the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
So police are convinced that X person committed the crime. They don't have enough evidence. So they coerce a confession, not because they think they're coercing a confession out of an innocent person, but they're trying to prove the person's guilty. Or they bring in a Dwayne Deaver to create blood spatter, fake science, or they do all kinds of other things which are laid out in the book to strengthen their case. They use hair analysis, which is sort of another form of junk science. They use snitches and informers, and reward those people. I mean, imagine if we said to somebody, "Listen, if you would just come in and testify to this alibi, we'll give you a reward of $10,000."
Right.
We'd be in jail. But
Right.
prosecutors and police officers do that all the time, every day, and nobody blinks about it. So, it's the system that operates with human beings, with human frailties, and I think part of it is this sort of culture of the adversary system on steroids. I think that, you know, police in particular have lost sight of the fact that every time an innocent person gets convicted, it means the guilty person has gone free to commit other crimes.
Right.
So the goal is not to get a conviction. The goal is to get the right conviction.
Right.
And I think it's really human frailty that ultimately gets in the way of that.
Yeah, it just made me think of something. So a lot of the stories end in lawsuits where the wrongly convicted are going to sue the government and try to get some degree of compensation. It's never enough for what they suffered. But has there ever been a case where the police wrongfully convict, the system wrongfully convicts, and the killer goes free and then kills again? Has there ever been lawsuits where the victims of the new crimes sue because they screwed up and didn't get the killer the first time? Is that a thing?
I'm not aware of that, and I think part of the problem is, who do they owe a duty of due diligence and good faith to? I don't know that there's a duty, and in order to sue somebody for negligence, they have to have a duty to you, and I'm not sure that the police have a legal duty to the family of a victim. Unknown
future victim.
Exactly.
Darn it. Okay.
Well, there's another legal technicality that we have to deal with.
Well, there's a lot of them, like qualified immunity.
Yes.
Which I try not to use the bad language on the podcast, but qualified fucking immunity. Like, you talk so brilliantly in this book and bluntly about the prosecution and the unfettered power that a prosecution has at basically every facet. They decide whether to bring charges, what charges to bring, what plea offer, if any, who they're going to call, what they're going to withhold or disclose. They're not supposed to withhold, exculpatory information. They do it all the time. So they have this unfettered power, yet that they and other players in this system, they're very hard to hold accountable, aren't they?
Well, prosecutors are impossible to hold accountable. They have absolute immunity. So prosecutors and judges have absolute immunity. They could turn around and indict me tomorrow because of my book, and a jury could acquit me in a minute and a half, and I would have no recourse against that prosecutor, even if he admitted that he indicted me because of the book, because he has absolute immunity. And that's completely created by the Supreme Court. Similarly, police officers have what's called good faith immunity. So you have to jump through all kinds of hoops to prove that there was a known constitutional right that they at least recklessly violated and deprived somebody of their constitutional right. It's a very tough burden. And again, it's completely created by judges. It was not ever in the statute. It was not ever at the common law. And the one thing that Clarence Thomas and I agree on in the world is that qualified immunity is a figment of somebody's imagination.
Is there any hope that can be changed in the future? I mean, what can we do about that?
Well, I think there are cases pending, and there's certainly a movement to try to fix it. And in certain states, they've actually eliminated good faith immunity through legislation. Okay. And it's a small minority of states, maybe one or two.
Yeah.
That's the other way to go, is on state claims to eliminate qualified immunity in state courts.
All right. Well, we like to infuse a little bit of hope into these horrible stories, so that's something. I'll take it. And then I'm gonna jump on something you just said in your hypothetical example that you could be prosecuted by someone who didn't like your book. There's a story in your book about you getting prosecuted that for representation.
Well, I wasn't prosecuted. I was threatened with
You were
prosecution.
threatened with prosecution.
Yes.
So much so, though, you had to get lawyers and go to court and be represented. And I was just kind of interested to hear. Most of us lawyers don't have that other side perspective. What did you learn about being a lawyer as when you were a client?
Well, actually, I learned a few things. I learned fear.
Yeah,
I learned the fear that our clients feel when they are being threatened with prosecution. Uh, I learned how powerful a prosecutor really is because I had done nothing that was in any way illegal. Indeed, what I had done was particularly sanctioned by the federal rules of criminal procedure and Rule 6E, and allowing a defense attorney to disclose grand jury transcripts to his client. There was never any doubt about that. Um, and I learned, interestingly enough, that clients really appreciate lawyers who communicate with them um, at times when it's not expected. So I remember uh,
interesting.
it was really interesting. Earl Silbert is a great Washington, D.C. lawyer. He was. He was a U.S. attorney. He was a Republican, but he was, he was a really well-known uh, lawyer and a great lawyer. And so we hired him to sort of present our case to the Department of Justice if we ever got that far. And I remember Earl calling me on a Saturday to talk about something that he had been thinking about in my case. And I remember being struck by the fact that this guy in Washington, D.C., who was a big name. I was a baby lawyer at the time. I was out of law school like 5 years or something, 6 years. Um, and he was calling me on a weekend to talk about my case with me and to talk about something that he was thinking about on a weekend related to my case. And I just thought to myself, wow, that that says something to me. And so as a result of that, I have never hesitated to pick up a phone and tell a client when I was thinking about something that occurred to me about his case or her case. And I've done it for years. I've never, clients never said anything to me about it. But it really hit me how important that was to me as a client. And so I sort of incorporated it into my approach to my clients. Not to make things up, but if I was sitting around, as we all do, on a weekend, you're at the pool and you're thinking about something and something just pops in your head. Uh,
Yep.
and so, now if I got home, I would either, now I'd probably send an email. But at the time I would call and I would say,
Yep.
I was just sitting around thinking about this and I thought about this, and tell me about the facts here because that may make a difference.
Yep.
And so that's really a big lesson that I learned just in terms of client management and client relations.
Dude, was it hard? Was it hard when you're sitting? I mean, we love to be up there making our case, and we love to be in control and doing our lawyer stuff. But the idea of you having to sit there while other people talk for you in court, was that tough at all, or were you just happy to be like, let these, they know what they're doing. Let's let them do it.
No, no, I'm a control freak, So,
Well, I
so
think we all are.
I wasn't like, oh, gee, I'll just tune out here. But the scariest point, Doug, and I think I talk about this in the book, is when we went into the judge's chambers. And it was the judge who was presiding over my client's case, and he had set a trial for the next month. And the prosecutor was threatening to indict us for allegedly leaking grand jury materials to our client. and was basically making the argument that we couldn't represent our client because we were under investigation. He was trying to get us off the case.
Yeah, because you were doing too good of a job, I think,
Well,
is what the
I don't know
problem
why.
was.
I don't know why, but he wanted us off the case.
Okay.
And so, the judge called us into chambers. Um, I was there with my Raleigh lawyer, who was an old friend of the judge's, and the judge said to the prosecutor, "Listen, we have a trial set for next month, and we're going to go ahead and do this trial. Now, if you indict Mr. Rudolph and Mr. Beskin, we'll do their trial next month. But if you don't, then we're going to try Mr. Hobby here next month. So it's your choice. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm just telling you that I'm not going to relieve them of representing Mr. Hobby. If you think you have a case to indict, go ahead and indict him, and we'll try him next month."
Nice.
I'm sitting there listening to this, and I'm thinking, I really don't like this choice that has been put to the prosecutor. But the judge obviously knew what he was doing, and the prosecutor came back the next day and said that they were going to proceed with the case against my client, and I never heard anything more about the alleged investigation.
So the judge understood the concept of chicken, the game of chicken.
He did understand that concept,
Yeah.
that when you're the object of the game, it's not so easy.
Yeah, well, especially if you think you may end up in trial in a month,
Exactly.
which for people who watch TV doesn't seem like a big deal because like they get the case and they're in trial the next day. But yeah, it takes a little more time than that in real life.
Yes.
So I I think I could talk about the book a lot more, but I do want to get to the staircase. But just in terms of, well, it's a good segue because the Peterson trial is part of the book. And I was watching, I think maybe like a teaser for the podcast or something with you and Sonia and you basically said the Peterson case was, in your mind, the greatest injustice of all the cases that you've ever handled, and it still keeps you up at night how a jury could have ever convicted him. So before I get to Peterson, we've spent so much time talking about the way that you connect with your clients and get so emotionally invested in the outcome of their case. And anybody who's ever done this work has had at least one trial that still haunts them to this day, and it rips you from the inside out. And you've had a whole stack of them, and you've sat by people on death row and the whole bit. And I think this profession of ours is hazardous to our health in a lot of ways because of those connections we make and the trauma that we experience and all that. I just want to know, like, what do you tell a lawyer who's doing this work and who's as emotionally involved in it as you are? What's the advice about how they get through this alive, that they come out of this in one piece, or not not addicted, not having a heart attack? We've all lost comrades along the way. What would you say?
Well, since I had a heart attack at age 48,
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm probably not a good person to give advice about that
You're
particular
still here.
topic. I'm still here. It's 24 years later. I'm still here. I'm still doing the same thing. Um, you know, it's funny. Sometimes when I talk to law students or recent graduates, they want to talk about, well, I want to do criminal law, but I want to have a balance in life. A work life balance.
Yep.
And it's really simple. Don't be a criminal defense lawyer, because there is no work life balance when if you're really if you're doing this because it's what you believe you should be doing. If you're not doing this just to make money, which I hope people don't do because there's lots of better ways to make money. Um, uh, if you're doing this because you really care about what you're doing, there is no real work life balance because something's going to come up at some point where you're going to sacrifice time with your family or time with your friends or time, with recreation because you have to do something for somebody else because guess what? They are depending on you. You know, their life is in your hands. And sometimes that's literally if you're doing a death penalty case. And
Yeah.
so it's one thing you can have work life balance when the only person you're adversely affecting by the balance is you. I mean, if you're working for IBM and you want to have work life balance, and that means you're not going to get promoted as fast as the guy next to you, okay, that's your choice, and the only person that's being hurt by that is you. But if you're talking about work life balance when you're representing another human being who's facing the death penalty or life in prison or decades in prison, and it's your responsibility to help that person as best you can, I'm sorry, but at that point, work life balance has to give up to your duty to your client. And so I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but
Well, it's depressing, but okay. But so find some moments to recharge your battery and find some things in life that can give you some peace and
oh,
distance from it.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I
What do you do?
I took a scuba diving because when
Perfect.
I when I am under the water with scuba, I am in a different world.
Nice.
I'm not in our world. I'm in a totally different world. I can't think about my cases anymore. I'm thinking about this fish over here and that piece of coral over there. And so I'm literally immersed in another
Nice.
world.
Nice.
So
Nice.
that's how I get away from it. Or I ski. And, when I'm out skiing, again, I'm thinking about the snow and the bumps and the trees, and I'm not thinking about my cases. So
Nice.
that's
Nice.
how I disengage.
That's good. That's like meditation. You're just getting your mind
Exactly.
way off of it. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, for me, it's always been story, movies, all that stuff. That's been my refuge and my escape. And so luckily, I've been able to kind of integrate that into my daily life as a lawyer and in with the work that I do. But I think that's probably what brought me to you, because way back in the day, before anybody really heard about the staircase too much, I found this amazing documentary, and it was really, people don't understand. I think this is the original, and in my opinion, the very best long form true crime documentary series. And as a documentary filmmaker, I was riveted. I mean, it just chapter by chapter. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't want the twists and turns. You couldn't have written a crazier screenplay out of your fucking bare imagination. And so this is my gentle segue into the staircase, because this is, and so the staircase took a while, I think, to find its audience, but it surely did, and went on to Netflix and had a whole second series of episodes to be produced, and it's so in the zeitgeist in terms of people talking about did he do it and did he do it, blah 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 blah. So I would be remiss, and I feel dirty for doing this, but I've told a couple of people, "Hey man, I'm gonna have David Rudolph on this podcast," and they're like, "You're gonna ask him about the owl theory, aren't you?" And I'm like, "I don't know, man. You gotta ask him about the owl theory." So let's just get that out of the way right now. What's the deal with the owl theory, David?
Well, actually, I think it has a lot of merit.
Oh, boom! There it is. Tell me.
Yeah, and yeah, no, I mean, uh, I think that when one looks at some of the things that I had tunnel vision about,
Okay,
Exactly.
wait. I hate to interrupt, but it dawns on me that there are going to be two people listening to this podcast who have no idea what we're talking about. So, in a nutshell, a wife is found at the bottom of the staircase in her home, bloody, head injuries, crazy head injuries, blood everywhere. The husband is charged. They say he beat her to death, and you argued at trial that it was a fall. And then there's this other theory that maybe an owl did it. So now go.
Well, that was a somewhat skewed summary, uh, but
Brevity is the soul of wit, don't they?
yeah,
Don't they
yeah.
say that?
Well, the bottom line was the head injuries were not consistent with blunt force trauma. There was no skull fracture. There were no brain injuries. There was no brain bruising. There was no subdural hematoma. There was nothing that you normally have with blunt force trauma. And the alleged murder weapon we found, uh, and it wasn't the murder weapon. So the prosecutor had no murder weapon and no brain injuries that are consistent with a blunt force trauma beating. But for various reasons, which somebody will just have to watch the staircase to understand, my client was convicted. After he was convicted, a neighbor came to me and ran this theory by me, which was that there were barred owls in that neighborhood. And the theory was that Kathleen Peterson, the victim, so called, had gone out to the front of the house to put up some Christmas decorations because it was early December, and that a barred owl had flown down, thought that she was with some little animals because she was putting out little reindeer, and had attacked her head with his claws. And indeed, when you looked at the wounds on her head, it was very reminiscent of the three prongs of an owl's talons. So that was the theory. It was poo-pooed at the time. I didn't sort of give it any credence at the time, but then over time, you started hearing stories about people who had been attacked by barred owls in various places. One attack occurred in 2008, I think about 5 years after the trial, about 10 miles away from Durham, in a place called Fuquay Varina. Uh,
Wow.
Other attacks occurred all over the country. So the neighbors started getting these stories together, found experts, and as it turned out, you can read an article in Audubon about how barred owls have been known to attack human beings. They attack the head. If you Google barred owls attacking people, you will come up with scores of news articles about incidents like that. Now, of course, we
Wow.
didn't have that back in 2003. We didn't have access to that kind of information. But in any event, I won't bore you with all the details, but there are some pieces of evidence that are consistent with that theory. It's certainly a more plausible theory to me than the beating theory. I don't know if it's more plausible than the fall theory, but it's certainly not an outlandish theory. And I can get up and give a closing argument on the owl theory and probably convince people that at a minimum there's a reasonable doubt about whether that's what happened.
Yeah. And did I read somewhere they actually found feathers?
Yeah, they found feathers in her hair. They found, or in her hands. I can't remember which now. They found a twig, and in
Wow.
her hands. And there's blood outside, which is not easily explainable. So there are facts that support the theory. And
Yeah.
actually, at some of my presentations, I do a little mini closing argument about it,
Oh,
and
nice.
I get a fairly good number of people saying, "Yeah, the owl did it."
Nice. Unbelievable. The idea, there's so many people out there who are just so inherently cynical about defendants and defense lawyers, and they'll make fun of that. But they made fun of the whole defense in general. And what they did is they took the documentary and they leveled some. I just want to get your take on this because I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I feel like it was, for me, a lot of vindication about what I do, which is the idea of, if you want the judge to truly see the humanity of our client, ideally you'd bring them into the home and sit with them and hold court and get the. Not going to happen. That video, this filmmaking, is really the closest thing we can get to out of the courtroom in their element, seeing them as a human being. And the Staircase, the original, is what, 8 episodes, 9, 10 episodes, and you're spending so much time with Michael Peterson, and you feel like you're getting to know him. And as you feel like it, he's a flawed character in any great story, but you connect with him. And for me, I'm thinking, there's no fucking way this guy did it. I just felt like I knew him by the end of this. The cynics will say, well, that's just the filmmakers who are French doing selective editing to make us feel something that's just not true. And you lived through a lot of these moments, and you saw the movie, and you know him best. Do you think the filmmakers were playing games with this documentary?
No, and I think that, interestingly enough, there's a lot of people who have the very opposite reaction to Michael that you had. I have heard from numerous people. People send me emails or text messages, or they respond on my website, and I have heard many, many times he did it. He's a psychopath. He's a narcissist. The way he acted with his kid, he made jokes about everything that was going on. There were you identify with him, I identified with him, but there are a lot of people who did not like Michael Peterson as portrayed in that documentary. And I think the reality is that the Michael Peterson that was portrayed in that documentary is in fact the Michael Peterson who exists in real life. He is sarcastic. He's flippant. He's smart. He's condescending at times. I don't think they painted him in a particularly positive way, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think they just filmed him as he was going on. There weren't any takes. They didn't say, "Hey, can you do that again?" They were just filming him as stuff happened.
That is interesting. And I'm just thinking about, okay, who are the people that do like him from the documentary, and who are the people that don't like him? I get it. And in a sense, I think about this divide that we talk about in our common discourse now about the elite. Like he's very erudite. He smokes a pipe. He's, smart guy, and sometimes the smartest guy in the room, or wants to be. Yep. I guess I could see how that rubs people wrong, but not liking a guy is a long way from, could he have beaten his wife to death with a, whatever, but it's a mystery.
Well, people make that jump, I think, pretty easily.
So what I really want to talk about before I let you go is the TV show, but this is sentencing. This is supposed to be a sentencing podcast, and we'll do big spoiler alerts, but in this case, you had finally the exoneration, where Michael Peterson is going to get out of jail, but this goes back to the power of the prosecutor. They're not willing to let this thing go. They want to plead guilty to something just because. So I don't know why. You tell me what motivates a prosecutor to do that. But he did this thing called an Alfred plea, which is saying, I'm not going to admit guilt, but I'll admit that there's enough to convict, and we'll go from there. And I probably misstated that. But the point is, you had to get a man that you believed in your heart it was innocent in front of a judge to plead guilty. And that sentencing is maybe not the best example of this question I'm going to ask you, because it seemed like pretty pro forma, like you knew the outcome. The judge was going to accept the plea and send him on his way. But we, as lawyers, this is one thing. I've interviewed a lot of people on a lot of topics in this podcast, but that's one thing I haven't talked about is what do you do when you have an innocent client that has to be sentenced? Because a lot of our clients, especially the few that go to trial, they go to trial because they're innocent. And then they get convicted. And then they have to go before a sentencing judge. And a lot of times they're not going to say, yeah, well, I'm really guilty. Sorry. That's not how this works. What do you do when you have to go before a judge for sentencing with a client you think is innocent?
Well, I think it's much harder after a trial than it is if you're just entering a plea. Because if you're just entering a plea, it's sort of between you and your conscience and the client that you think the client is really innocent. Now, when I explain Alfred pleas in places like Scotland or even Canada, lawyers are horrified. I mean, I had a lawyer in a very well-known, barrister in Scotland tell me he would never have pled Michael Peterson guilty, regardless of an Alfred plea. It was unconscionable to do that. I don't suffer from that problem. For me, it's all about what's the result for the client and what's going to serve his or her best interests.
Yeah.
But I think it's really difficult at a trial. I think back to the trials I had. Now, to a certain extent, sentencing guidelines have made that easier in a way, because you can focus on sort of the spaces in the sentencing guidelines where you have room to make arguments. So, you can say things like, well, yeah, he was convicted of this, but, the intended loss really wasn't that. You can make those kinds of technical arguments, which I guess is a lot easier than making the sort of heartfelt plea that he really didn't deserve this. I think in other situations, I think what you have to do is stress the good parts of your client's life and just put the act that he's convicted of to the side, and talk about what he or she has done in other parts of their life. Again, it's bringing context, I think, to the judge and the prosecutor, for that matter. And I think that's what our job is in that situation, is to bring context. So, okay, a jury found him guilty, but let me tell you about who this person is, and why the punishment for that ought not be as harsh as you might think it ought to be.
Right.
So you're really in that position, I think, ameliorating or trying to ameliorate the impact of the jury verdict. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it goes back to, okay, maybe he's guilty. The jury said so, but we're not going to let his worst moment in life define who he is,
Right.
In his heart and his whole. I do a lot of work with a great lawyer named Alan Ellis. I don't know if you know Alan.
Yeah, I know Alan. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's coined a phrase. We like to talk about the things our client does when no one's keeping score.
Right.
These great deeds throughout life when no one's looking and they're not trying to prove they're a good guy because they're charged with a crime or anything else. And that is how we reveal true character.
Yeah, now that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, the idea of innocent people pleading guilty, we talk about innocent people getting convicted at trial, but you talk about, I think in the book, back to the book, it's like something like 2 to 8%. They've done studies based on subsequent exonerations that a lot of those people just pled guilty. So tell me about, we'll start where we began, which is systemic deficiencies. What is wrong with the system that innocent people they're not even going to trial, they're just standing up and pleading guilty?
What's wrong is that the penalties have become so draconian, and the incentives to plead guilty have become so enormous that it takes the unusual person now to take the risk of going to trial. When I started a long time ago in federal court, prosecutors would not make second sentencing recommendations. Their view was, my job is to prosecute the case, and then sentencing is up to the judge. And they wouldn't make a recommendation. In the Southern District of New York or in the Eastern District of New York, prosecutors did not make sentencing recommendations. And I think that's the way it ought to be. And so back in those days, if I had a client who wanted to go to trial, I would say to the client, listen, if you want to go to trial, that's fine. We can go to trial. If you get convicted, you're likely to get sentenced to X. If you were to plead guilty, you might get X minus, a year, because the judge will appreciate your acceptance of responsibility. We didn't call it that as a factor, but it was something we recognized, that judges would, take that into account. You didn't put the system through a trial. You admitted to what you did, and they would cut you a little break. But it wasn't like 30 years. Now, in federal court particularly, but even in state courts in most jurisdictions, the difference between going to trial and pleading can be literally decades. I mean, decades. That puts enormous pressure on people.
Yeah.
So we call it the trial penalty. I'm sure you call it the trial penalty in Arizona.
Yep.
It's the penalty you get for having the audacity to actually demand what the Constitution provides for you, which is a trial by your peers. And if you have the audacity to do that, instead of playing ball with the prosecutors and informing on other people and providing substantial assistance and all the other catchphrases that we know, then you get hammered.
Right.
And so the results are sort of self-evident.
Right.
Very few people go to trial.
And it's a bail problem too, because a lot of people
Absolutely.
can get that, they're rotting in jail waiting, and then all of a sudden, hey, time served plea, you could get out
Oh,
tomorrow.
well, and
Okay.
that's particularly prevalent with the lower level offenses.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody gets popped for a petty larceny, and they're in jail on $250 bond, which they can't make. And
Yeah.
they're sitting there for weeks. And the lawyer comes to them and says, listen, the prosecutor's offered you a time served plea. If you enter a plea of guilty tomorrow, he'll agree, time served, you're out. On the other hand, if you want to go to trial, I don't know when we're going to get to it.
Yeah. And you may
So,
do another 5 years after the trial. So,
right. So,
yeah,
what's the person going to do?
it's a devil's bargain.
Yeah.
And I think really, as far as the false plea agreements, maybe it takes us back to the power of the prosecutor too, because those draconian punishments that you talk about aren't always necessarily, they don't always necessarily have to be in play unless the prosecutor charges a case in a certain way.
Well, and that's what they do. I mean, let's be real. I mean, you can plead to an information to a conspiracy count in an information with a 5-year cap, or we'll go to trial on the money laundering, and it's a 20-year
Mm-hmm.
exposure, and that's completely set up by the prosecutor.
I learned that lesson the hard way as a baby public defender in Maricopa County on a state case where I had a juvenile, 16 years old, who pointed an unloaded shotgun at some neighborhood bullies and screamed, "Who's the pussy now?" and went in the house. And it was right after Columbine, so the prosecutors wanted to really, kids and guns. So it's charged with a gun is a mandatory minimum, child victims are mandatory minimum, 3 counts. If he went to trial, he was charged as an adult looking at a mandatory minimum 30 years in prison. Just by virtue of the way the prosecutor chose to charge that case. And it was a great case to take to trial for any number of reasons. But there's no fucking way you're going to go with a 16-year-old boy and risk that he gets a 30-year mandatory. And mandatory means the judge isn't going to want to sentence this kid to 30 years. No choice. Right. No choice. And, to circle the square in your book, I think another big word that helps define one of the big problems in all this is the concept of finality. And I think I heard you talk about that on Good Morning America. Because once these horrible wrongful convictions occur, you get an appeal, you may get a 2255, but then it's like you're done. That's it. There's just no way to challenge this stuff.
Well, and even if there's a way to challenge it, judges elevate finality over truth or justice. They want a case to be done. They're afraid of, quote, opening the floodgates. How many times have you heard that from a prosecutor? So finality becomes the goal of the system as opposed to justice. Finality may be good in some circumstances, but not when it trumps justice. Excuse the phrase.
All right. So do I have you for like 5 more minutes? It's because I want to talk about the fact that, a couple things. One is the staircase for any lawyers listening. If you want 3 hours of amazing CLE, the staircase series that David and I produced together with never before seen footage from the documentary. It's on junk science, ethics, and prior bad acts 404B is available on the NACDL website, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But it's really, really cool, and I'm a little biased because I was involved in the project, but I think it's the best 3 hours of CLE you're going to get this year. So check that out. But let's talk about, because the staircase, man, it's not going away. So HBO is coming out next month with a scripted mini series about the staircase and Michael Peterson. So the first question I have, how surreal is it that you've got a amazing actor like Michael Stuhlbarg who is going to be portraying you on television? Like, what must that be like to see yourself being played by an actor on TV? That's weird.
It is weird. For one thing, I don't really think he looks like me, so that's sort of hard to accept. At least he's not deformed in any way. But
well, he's clearly not as handsome. Let's just put it out there.
I wasn't going to say that, but I appreciate your. But yeah, it's weird. I had nothing to do with any of the production. They wouldn't even take my my professional advice about how things work in the court. So I don't really know how it'll come out. But he's a great actor. Colin Firth plays Michael Peterson. Juliette Binoche, I guess, plays his wife.
You know what I'm going to say is my all-time favorite casting decision in this show, right?
Parker Posey.
As Freda Black, pure tea filth. I cannot wait to see Parker Posey chew on that role.
It'll be interesting.
What else can you tell us about this? Since given that this episode, this podcast is going to air afterwards, is there any good inside baseball that we need to know about?
Here's what I'll tell you. I have heard that they have me meeting Michael Peterson in a diner for the first time. That's not true. They have me taking a phone call while I'm exercising on a running thing, like a Nordic track. That's not true. They have me in the grand jury when the prosecutor is presenting the evidence to the grand jury, that's obviously not true. Um, uh,
Yeah.
you know, so they got some things just factually wrong. But I am told that the story itself, and particularly the portrayal of the Petersons' relationship, is actually pretty realistic and pretty accurate. And so I think that's to the filmmakers' credit, that they didn't sensationalize it. That I think they showed these people as real human beings and showed their relationship, at least from what I've heard, consistently with everything that I knew when I represented Michael. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm really hoping, Doug, that the reason I did the documentary was because I really wanted people to see what we do as defense lawyers. I wanted them to see how the baloney was made, and I had lots of positive comments from people about really understanding our role a lot better after watching the Staircase documentary. Yep. My hope is that is not undone in any way by how defense lawyers are portrayed in the HBO series. So that's my one concern, and we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I can't wait. And I saw that your wife is in the show too. That there's an actress named Terry Weibel who I've never heard of, because a little known fact: Sonia's former career was a journalist, and she covered the Peterson trial, and so apparently she's in this show. Did you know that?
Yeah. She actually really wanted to do the cameo.
Well, she should have, man.
Oh, she absolutely should have done the cameo. But anyway,
she's so good on camera.
Do it, and I think she's just there interviewing Caitlin or Candace or somebody. I think
interesting. That's okay, well, I can't wait. I'm going to let you go, but I wanted to say thank you so much for spending such a great hour and a half with us today. Most importantly, thank you for what you do to further justice in our country and our broken system. For anyone who's listening, I highly suggest you go on Amazon or we still have bookstores these days.
Yeah, or you can go. My website is www.davidsrudolph.com, and there's information about the book right there as well.
The book is American Injustice: Inside Stories from the Underbelly of the Criminal Justice System, and also the podcast with Sonia Pfeiffer called Abuse of Power, available exclusively on Audible. David Rudolph, thank you so much for being on Set for Sentencing today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.